Before anything changes in your life, there is something you must confront with honesty, because many people are trying to grow spiritually without understanding what they are lacking, and when you misdiagnose your spiritual condition, you will misapply your spiritual effort. And when effort is applied in the wrong direction, it produces frustration instead of transformation. There are believers who are sincere, committed, even disciplined, yet something is missing at the core of their spiritual experience, something that makes their prayer feel dry, their authority feel weak, and their spiritual life feel limited. And that missing element is not effort, it is not desire, it is not even knowledge, it is power. As revealed in, there is a moment where the call is made clearly. There is no point in being a Christian without the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And this is not presented as an optional experience, but as a foundational necessity. Because without it, you are trying to fight spiritual battles with natural strength, and natural strength cannot sustain supernatural warfare. Many people pray, but their prayer remains within the limits of language, within the limits of reasoning, within the limits of emotion, and because of that, they never cross into that dimension where prayer becomes force, where prayer becomes movement, where prayer begins to operate beyond the mind and begins to engage the spirit. This is where many believers stop without realizing it. They pray but they do not ascend. They speak but they do not enter. They desire but they do not receive. And over time, this creates a subtle frustration that is often misinterpreted as delay, when in reality it is limitation. What if the problem is not that God is silent, but that we are operating at a level that cannot perceive His response? What if the issue is not distance, but capacity? What if the struggle is not about effort, but about access? Because there is a difference between praying and being empowered to pray. There is a difference between speaking words and being carried by the Spirit. There is a difference between religious activity and spiritual ignition. And until that difference is understood, many will continue to circle around the same level of experience, calling it growth while remaining within the same boundary. This is why moments like this are not casual, they are not routine. They are invitations into another dimension, a dimension where prayer is no longer constructed but released, where language is no longer controlled but transformed, where something begins to move inside a person that cannot be explained by logic and cannot be sustained by effort alone. And the instruction is simple but profound. When that shift begins, do not retreat. Do not return to what is familiar. Do not try to control what is being bettered, because many people abort what God is initiating simply because it feels unfamiliar and they prefer what is known over what is powerful. But growth in the Spirit will always feel unfamiliar before it becomes natural. And transformation will always feel uncomfortable before it becomes stable. So the question is no longer whether you desire more, but whether you are willing to move beyond what is comfortable, whether you are willing to release control, whether you are willing to step into a dimension where prayer is no longer something you manage, but something that carries you. Because from that point forward, everything begins to change. Not just how you pray, but how you see, how you respond, how you resist, and how you stand. And what once felt difficult begins to shift. Not because life has become easier, but because you are no longer operating from the same level. Once a person begins to step into this dimension, the next reality they must understand is that spiritual power is not an event but a state. It is not something you receive once and then move on from. It is something that must be sustained, cultivated, and continually renewed. Because what many people call an experience was never meant to be a moment. It was meant to become a condition. And this is where many begin well but fail to continue. They receive something real, something undeniable, something that shifts their awareness, but they do not remain in that flow. They return to normal patterns, normal thinking, normal speaking, and slowly what was once alive becomes distant, not because it has disappeared, but because it has not been maintained. As seen in, even those who have received the baptism are instructed to keep being filled to top it up, to remain in that state of overflow. Because spiritual capacity is not static. It either increases or it diminishes. It either expands through use or contrasts through neglect. And many believers do not realize that what they are experiencing is not attack, it is depletion. There is a difference between being opposed and being empty. And if you are empty, even small resistance will feel overwhelming. Even minor pressure will feel like defeat, because you are trying to respond from a place that has not been reinforced. This is why consistency becomes more important than intensity, because a single powerful moment cannot replace a sustained spiritual life, and a single encounter cannot compensate for a lack of daily alignment. What you carry must be maintained, what you receive must be reinforced, what is ignited must be protected, because anything left unattended will eventually weaken. And this is where the discipline of spiritual life becomes clear, not as a burden, but as a structure that preserves what has been given. Because without structure, experiences fade, and without intentionality, even genuine encounters lose their impact over time. So the question becomes deeper now. Not just have you received, but are you remaining? Not just did something happen, but is it still happening? Not just did you feel something, but are you living from it? Because there is a difference between touching something and dwelling in it. There is a difference between visiting a dimension and being established in it. And what transforms a life is not what you visit occasionally, but what you inhabit consistently. And this is where many must make a decision whether they will treat spiritual power as a moment of excitement or as a lifestyle of alignment, whether they will depend on occasional encounters or build a continuous flow, because growth does not come from moments, it comes from patterns. And what you repeat is what you become. So if the flow is not sustained, the clarity will fade, the sensitivity will reduce, and the authority will weaken. But if it is maintained, something begins to stabilize within you, something becomes consistent, something becomes reliable, and you begin to operate not from effort, but from a place of alignment, where what you do is no longer forced, but natural, no longer constructed, but flowing. And from that place, your prayer begins to change, your perception begins to sharpen, and your response to life begins to shift, because you are no longer reacting from the surface. You are operating from depth, and depth changes everything. As this flow begins to stabilize within a person, something deeper must be understood, because receiving and maintaining are not enough if there is no surrender. And this is where many encounter an invisible resistance within themselves, not from external forces, but from internal control. Because the moment prayer begins to move beyond your understanding, the mind tries to regain control, it tries to interpret, to regulate, to return to what is familiar. And this is why many people interrupt what God is initiating, not out of rebellion, but out of discomfort. Because what they cannot explain, they struggle to trust. And what they cannot control, they hesitate to continue. Yet as reflected in, there is a clear instruction. When the language begins to change, do not go back, do not retreat into what you understand, because that shift is not confusion, it is transition. It is not disorder, it is expansion. And if you reverse it, you return to limitation without realizing it. This is the moment where faith must replace logic, where trust must override familiarity, where you must allow what is being formed within you to continue even when your mind cannot define it. Because spiritual growth does not begin where understanding is complete. It begins where control is released. Many people want transformation, but they want to remain in control. They want power, but they want to regulate it. They want depth, but they want it to remain comfortable. And this creates a contradiction that limits their progress. Because true transformation always requires a level of surrender that feels uncomfortable at first. What if the reason many people do not move forward is not because they lack opportunity, but because they resist transition? What if the barrier is not external, but internal? What if the limitation is not imposed, but maintained, because every new level requires the release of the previous one, and every deeper dimension requires the surrender of what once felt sufficient. And if you hold on to what is familiar, you will never fully step into what is available. This is why the instruction is simple but demanding. Continue. Stay with it. Allow it to develop. Do not retreat. Do not analyze prematurely. Do not interrupt the process, because what is being formed is not just a new way of praying. It is a new capacity, a new sensitivity, a new level of connection that will redefine how you experience everything. And once this begins to take root, something changes permanently. Your awareness sharpens, your spirit becomes more responsive, your prayer becomes less about words and more about flow, less about effort and more about alignment. And from that point, you are no longer trying to reach something distant. You are learning to operate from something that is already within. And that shift marks the beginning of a different kind of life, not just spiritually active, but spiritually alive. When this inner shift begins to take root, another reality must be faced with clarity, because spiritual activation without direction can still lead to stagnation, and this is where many believers become active but not effective, engaged but not advancing, because they have power but lack alignment. And when power is not directed, it becomes scattered instead of productive. The truth is, not every movement is progress, and not every activity produces results, because in the realm of the spirit, location matters, alignment matters, positioning matters, and if you are operating out of place, even sincere effort will yield limited outcomes. This is why the cry for alignment begins to emerge. The recognition that something deeper must shift beyond the internal experience, something must reposition you, something must connect you to what has been prepared but not yet assessed. As reflected in, there is a moment where the focus turns toward breaking barriers, unlocking gates, and confronting invisible limitations that restrict access. Because there are dimensions of life that are not entered by effort alone. They require spiritual authorization. They require alignment with what is already established. Many people are working hard, praying intensely, yet opportunities pass them by. Doors remain closed. Connections never form. And over time, this creates confusion because effort is present but results are inconsistent. And this inconsistency is often misinterpreted as delay, when in reality it is misalignment. What if the issue is not that your time has not come, but that your position has not shifted? What if the struggle is not about effort, but about location? What if the limitation is not external resistance, but internal displacement? Because there is a place where what you carry begins to attract what you need. There is a place where doors open without strain. There is a place where connections form naturally, not by force, but by alignment. And until you are positioned correctly, you may keep striving without entering. This is why the prayer changes at this level. It is no longer just about receiving power. It becomes about being directed, being guided, being moved into the right place at the right time, because timing without positioning still leads to missed opportunities. And positioning without awareness leads to wasted access. So something must shift within you, not just in capacity, but in direction. Not just in power, but in placement. Because once alignment begins, resistance loses its advantage, confusion begins to clear, and what once felt scattered begins to converge. And from that point forward, your life is no longer defined by random movement, but by intentional progression, where each step connects, each action builds, and each moment begins to carry purpose instead of uncertainty. But even when alignment begins to take place, there is another layer that must be confronted with seriousness, because positioning alone does not eliminate resistance. And many people assume that once they are in the right place, everything will flow effortlessly, yet they soon discover that there are still forces that oppose, still patterns that attempt to interrupt, still barriers that try to reassert themselves. And this is where spiritual awareness must deepen. Because not every delay is about misalignment. Some delays are maintained by resistance that must be intentionally broken, as reflected in there is a clear emphasis on confronting invisible barriers, breaking limitations, and refusing to negotiate with forces that seek to hold a person back, because there are moments in life where passivity prolongs struggle and silence allows patterns to continue unchallenged. Many people are waiting for change while tolerating what must be confronted. They are hoping for progress while accommodating what is restricting them. And over time, this creates a cycle where nothing truly shifts because nothing has been decisively addressed. What if the reason certain things persist is not because they are permanent, but because they have not been challenged? What if some limitations remain not because they are powerful, but because they have been accepted? What if the issue is not absence of opportunity, but absence of resistance against what is opposing? Because there is a difference between enduring a situation and confronting it. There is a difference between adapting to a limitation and breaking it. And many believers unknowingly adjust to what they were meant to overcome. They normalize delay. They rationalize setbacks. They reinterpret patterns as circumstances. And in doing so, they reduce their expectation without realizing it. This is where spiritual authority must be activated. Not in noise or emotion, but in clarity and conviction. Understanding that certain things will not change until they are addressed directly, until they are challenged with intention, until they are confronted with consistency. Because resistance does not respond to wishful thinking, it responds to sustained pressure. It responds to clarity of purpose. It responds to a refusal to accept what contradicts what is meant to be established. So the posture changes again from seeking to confronting, from waiting to engaging, from hoping to acting. And this shift is not about aggression. It is about responsibility. It is about recognizing that transformation requires participation, that progress requires intentionality, and that what you tolerate will eventually define your experience if it is not addressed. And once this becomes clear, something within you stabilizes. You begin to recognize patterns earlier. You begin to respond with greater precision, and you begin to understand that your role is not passive. It is participatory, not reactive, but intentional. And from that point forward, you are no longer simply navigating life. You are actively shaping your movement through it with awareness, authority, and consistency. As this level of awareness and authority begins to develop, something even more critical must be addressed, because it is possible to confront external resistance while still carrying internal limitations, and if the inner life is not aligned, the outer victories will not be sustained, because whatever is not transformed within will eventually recreate the same conditions without. Many people fight battles outside while ignoring what is forming inside. They address patterns around them but overlook the structures within them. And this creates a cycle where progress is achieved but not maintained, where breakthroughs happen but do not last, because the internal foundation has not been fully aligned. As reflected in, there is a moment where the focus turns inward, toward the heart, toward the thoughts, toward the unseen spaces where decisions are formed and directions are shaped, because the heart is not neutral. It is a center of influence, and whatever is established there will eventually express itself outwardly. What if some of the resistance you are confronting externally has a point of agreement internally? What if certain patterns persist because something within has not been fully addressed? What if the limitation is not only imposed but also reinforced? Because there is a difference between being attacked and being aligned with what is attacking, and until that distinction is made, the battle remains incomplete. This is why inner cleansing becomes essential, not as a concept, but as a process. The removal of what does not align, the breaking of internal agreements that sustain external patterns, the dismantling of thought structures that reinforce limitation. Many people want change without transformation. They want results without adjustment. They want movement without refinement. But true progress requires both external confrontation and internal alignment, because if one is missing, the other will not hold. And this is where discipline deepens again, not just in prayer, but in awareness, in thought, in response, in what is allowed and what is rejected, because the inner life must be guarded with the same seriousness as external battles are fought. So the question becomes more precise now. Not only what are you confronting, but what are you allowing? Not only what are you resisting, but what are you agreeing with? Not only what is happening around you, but what is being formed within you. Because once the inner life is aligned, something powerful begins to stabilize. Your reactions change, your decisions become clearer, your responses become more intentional, and what once triggered you begins to lose its influence because it no longer has a place to connect within. And from that point forward, your progress is no longer temporary. It becomes sustainable, it becomes consistent, it becomes established, because what is happening within you now supports what is happening around you. And that alignment is what transforms moments of breakthrough into a lifestyle of stability and growth. When the inner life begins to align and the external resistance is being confronted with clarity, there comes a decisive stage where recovery must take place. Because it is not enough to stop what is working against you, you must also reclaim what has been affected, what has been delayed, what has been diminished over time. And this is where many people stop prematurely. They celebrate the end of resistance but do not pursue restoration. They focus on breaking but neglect rebuilding, and as a result, they live free from certain pressures but still operate below what is possible for them. As reflected in, there is a strong emphasis on recovery, on calling back what has been lost, on restoring what has been interrupted, because progress is not complete until restoration has occurred. What if the goal is not just survival, but restoration? Not just relief, but recovery. Not just escape, but rebuilding, because anything that has been affected must be intentionally restored if it is to function at its full capacity again. Many people accept partial progress without realizing it. They move forward but leave parts of their life unresolved. They continue but carry the effects of past limitations. And over time, this creates a gap between what they could be experiencing and what they are actually living. This is why recovery requires intention, it requires clarity, it requires a decision to reclaim what belongs to you. Whether it is opportunity, confidence, direction, or capacity. Because whatever is not reclaimed remains absent. And absence creates limitation even in the presence of progress. And this process is not passive, it is deliberate. It is the act of calling back, restoring, re-establishing, and realigning what has been displaced. Because displacement is not always obvious. Sometimes it shows up as delay, sometimes as inconsistency, sometimes as a loss of momentum. But regardless of how it appears, it must be addressed. So the posture shifts again from confrontation to restoration, from breaking to rebuilding, from resisting to reclaiming. And this shift is essential because without it, progress remains incomplete. And as this begins to take place, something changes in how you experience your life. You are no longer just avoiding setbacks, you are actively restoring strength, restoring clarity, restoring direction, and over time, what was once fragmented begins to come together. What was once inconsistent begins to stabilize. And what was once delayed begins to accelerate. Not because circumstances have suddenly become favorable, but because what was missing has been intentionally restored. And that restoration closes the gap between potential and reality, allowing you to step fully into what was previously interrupted. At this final stage, everything begins to converge into a single reality that must not be ignored. because awareness, alignment, confrontation, and restoration all lead to one responsibility, and that is continuity, the ability to sustain what has been established. Because many people experience change but do not maintain it. They enter a new level but do not remain there. And over time, they find themselves returning to previous patterns. Not because those patterns are stronger, but because what replaced them was not sustained. As reflected in, there is a clear instruction to continue, to remain active, to keep engaging, to carry what has been received into daily life, because transformation is not proven by what happens in a moment, but by what continues afterward. What if the real test is not what you receive, but what you maintain? What if the measure of change is not intensity, but consistency? What if the difference between temporary progress and lasting transformation is not power, but persistence? Because anything that is not maintained will eventually weaken, and anything that weakens will eventually lose its influence. And this is why continuity becomes the final discipline. The ongoing decision to remain aligned, to remain aware, to remain engaged, to refuse to drift back into what has already been broken. Many people underestimate the power of consistency. They look for new experiences while neglecting what they have already received. They seek more without maintaining what is present, and in doing so, they create instability within their own progress. But stability is built through repetition, through daily alignment, through consistent engagement, and over time, this creates a foundation that is not easily shaken, a structure that is not easily disrupted, a life that is not easily redirected by external pressures. So the responsibility now becomes clear, not just to move forward, but to remain, not just to change, but to sustain, not just to receive, but to carry. Because what you carry consistently becomes what defines you. And as this continuity is established, something powerful begins to happen. Your life becomes less reactive and more intentional, less scattered and more focused, less uncertain and more stable, because you are no longer depending on moments to sustain you. You are operating from a place that has been built, reinforced, and maintained. And from that point forward, transformation is no longer something you visit occasionally. It becomes the environment you live in. Not something you chase, but something you embody. Not something temporary, but something established. And that is where real change is confirmed. Not in a single experience, but in a life that continues to reflect it.